Listen closely, because this may be the moment that changes how you understand love forever. The exact moment avoidants begin to attach deeply is not when you give more, explain more, or prove more. It's not when you sacrifice yourself, shrink your needs, or wait endlessly in silence. It happens in a quiet, invisible second, when something inside them finally feels safe enough to rest. And if you've ever wondered why they pull away just when things feel close, stay with me, because what you're about to hear may free your heart. Here is a truth few are willing to say: avoidants do not fear love, they fear losing themselves inside it. Their distance is not cruelty, it is protection. A protection learned early, practiced often, and reinforced by disappointment. The moment deep attachment begins is not dramatic. There is no confession, no sudden realization spoken aloud. It happens when the nervous system stops bracing for impact. Psychology teaches us that avoidance learned, usually very early, that closeness came with a cost. Love meant expectation. Connection meant obligation. Affection meant eventual loss. So they adapted. They became self-sufficient. They learned to regulate emotions alone. And independence became their sanctuary. Now listen carefully, because wisdom lives here. An avoidant begins attaching deeply when they are not required to perform, explain, or defend their distance. When they are allowed to exist without being pulled closer or pushed away. When presence feels steady, not demanding. This is where divine order enters human psychology. Love that heals does not chase. It stands. It does not collapse into fear. It remains rooted. When you stop trying to be chosen and instead choose yourself, something shifts. The energy changes. The dynamic resets. The avoidant feels it before they understand it. They sense that this connection does not consume, that it does not trap, that it does not threaten their autonomy. And for the first time, closeness feels optional, not forced. That is the moment. Attachment deepens when an avoidant realizes, I am free here. I am not losing myself. I am safe to return. This is why pressure pushes them away, but calm draws them in. This is why emotional maturity is magnetic. This is why boundaries, clear, loving, self-respecting boundaries, create security. Avoidants attach when they are no longer needed to fill a void. They attach when love is an offering, not a demand. When connection is an invitation, not a pursuit. And here is the sacred truth many miss. They often attach deepest after distance, after silence, after space reveals what presence quietly meant. Not because they enjoy absence, but because absence clarifies safety. When you stop abandoning yourself to keep them, you stop triggering their fear. When you honor your worth, you teach them how to honor connection. This is not manipulation. This is alignment. And whether they stay or go, this truth remains. The love meant for you will not require you to disappear. Let this wisdom ground you. Let it free you. And let your presence be so rooted in peace that anyone who enters your life feels safe enough to stay, by choice, not by force. Avoidants begin attaching deeply at the precise moment emotional safety outweighs their fear of losing autonomy. And this moment is far more internal and subtle than most people realize. For an avoidant, autonomy is not just a preference, it is a survival strategy. It was built in response to early experiences where closeness felt intrusive, overwhelming, inconsistent, or conditional. Somewhere in their nervous system, connection became associated with pressure, obligation, or the quiet erasure of self. So they learned to stay in control by staying distant. This is why attachment does not grow for them through intensity or pursuit, but through calm, steadiness, and emotional neutrality that feels non-threatening. Emotional safety, for an avoidant, means knowing they will not be engulfed, corrected, rushed, or emotionally cornered. It means their inner world is respected without interrogation. When someone approaches them with urgency, needing reassurance, clarity, or emotional reciprocity too quickly, the avoidant's fear of autonomy loss is activated. Their system interprets closeness as danger, not intimacy. In contrast, when presence is offered without expectation, something entirely different happens. Their defenses soften, not because they are convinced, but because they are no longer bracing. The shift begins when the avoidant senses they are not responsible for managing another person's emotional state. This is critical. Many avoidants grew up in environments where they had to self-regulate because caregivers were emotionally unavailable, unpredictable, or dependent. As adults, they unconsciously resist relationships that feel emotionally heavy. The moment they realize, I am not being pulled, fixed, or required to show up in a certain way, their nervous system starts to recalibrate. Safety enters first, attachment follows later. Autonomy is sacred to an avoidant. When emotional safety is high, autonomy does not feel threatened by closeness. It feels preserved within it. They begin to experience connection as something that coexists with independence rather than competes with it. This is when attachment begins forming quietly, not through grand gestures, but through repeated experiences of being accepted as they are. The avoidant watches carefully. They observe how you respond to their space. They notice whether distance is met with panic or with self-grounded calm. Every interaction becomes evidence for or against safety. Over time, emotional safety accumulates. It shows up in small moments, when they pull back and are not punished for it, when they return and are not interrogated, when vulnerability is met with steadiness instead of emotional intensity. Each moment sends a signal to their nervous system that closeness does not equal loss. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the internal equation changes. Autonomy no longer feels at risk in connection, and when that happens, attachment is no longer something to defend against. What makes this process confusing is that avoidants often do not consciously recognize this shift. They may still appear distant, they may still value space, but internally, a bond has formed. The attachment deepens not because they were persuaded, but because safety became familiar. Familiarity is powerful to an avoidant. When safety repeats, their body relaxes. When their body relaxes, emotions are allowed to surface. And when emotions surface without consequence, attachment takes root. This is why chasing an avoidant delays attachment rather than accelerates it. Pressure reinforces their fear. Emotional safety, on the other hand, disarms it. The moment emotional safety outweighs fear is the moment their internal walls stop being load-bearing. They no longer need distance to survive. And in that quiet shift, deep attachment begins, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that is stable, enduring, and real. Consistent presence without pressure is one of the most powerful forces in disarming an avoidance nervous system, because it directly contradicts the relational experiences that taught them to stay guarded in the first place. Avoidants are not shaped by a lack of desire for connection, but by repeated moments where connection felt unreliable, overwhelming, or conditional. Their nervous system learned that closeness often comes with demands, spoken or unspoken, that threaten their sense of control. So they adapted by creating distance, not to punish others, but to regulate themselves. When someone shows up consistently without pushing for more, something unfamiliar begins to register. Consistency, to an avoidant, is not about constant contact or emotional intensity. It is about predictability without intrusion. It is knowing that presence does not disappear when space is taken, and that space is not used as a weapon. This steady rhythm allows the avoidant's body to stop scanning for danger. Their system begins to recognize that connection can exist without emotional pressure attached to it. Pressure, even when subtle, activates an avoidant's defenses. Pressure can look like needing reassurance, expecting frequent emotional disclosure, or interpreting distance as rejection. Even well-intentioned attempts to fix the connection can feel invasive to someone whose autonomy is deeply tied to safety. Consistent presence without pressure sends a different message entirely. You are not responsible for managing me. That message alone can soften years of protective conditioning. Over time, the avoidant begins to notice patterns. They notice that you remain grounded when they take space. They notice that you do not escalate emotionally to regain closeness. They notice that you do not withdraw affection to punish distance. Each of these moments becomes evidence that this connection operates by different rules. The nervous system responds not to words, but to repeated experiences, and consistency builds trust at a level deeper than conscious thought. What is often misunderstood is that avoidants do not respond to emotional intensity in the Tao, same way secure or anxious individuals do. Intensity signals urgency, and urgency signals threat. Consistency, on the other hand, signals stability. When someone remains emotionally steady, regardless of closeness or distance, the avoidance system begins to settle. This settling is not immediate. It happens slowly, through repetition, through the absence of crisis. As the nervous system relaxes, curiosity replaces vigilance. The avoidant begins to feel less compelled to monitor the relationship for signs of control or engulfment. They may start initiating contact in small, tentative ways. They may linger longer in conversations. These behaviors are not conscious decisions to attach, but natural responses to safety. Attachment grows in the absence of threat. Consistent presence without pressure also allows the avoidant to approach vulnerability on doer denlik. When they feel pushed to open up, they retreat. When they feel invited without obligation, they explore. This autonomy in emotional expression is crucial. It allows vulnerability to emerge organically rather than defensively. And vulnerability, when met with calm acceptance, reinforces the safety loop even further. Eventually, the avoidance nervous system begins to associate your presence with regulation rather than stress. This is a profound shift. Instead of using distance to self-soothe, they begin to find soothing in connection itself. Not because they need it, but because it feels safe. That is the moment consistent presence has done its work. The walls did not come down through force or persuasion. They lowered because they were no longer needed. In this space, attachment forms quietly and steadily. It is not dramatic or overwhelming. It does not feel like losing oneself. It feels like gaining a place to rest. And for an avoidant, that kind of attachment is not only rare, it is transformative. True attachment in avoidance does not begin when someone tries harder, loves louder, or sacrifices more. It begins at the exact moment they are no longer being chased, fixed, or rescued. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in attachment psychology, because what feels like love and effort to one person can feel like pressure and control to an avoidant. Their nervous system is not calmed by pursuit, it is activated by it. Chasing signals urgency, and urgency suggests that something is wrong. For an avoidant, that something wrong often feels like an impending loss of autonomy. Avoidants learned early that their needs, emotions, or boundaries were either ignored or overwhelmed. In response, they developed self-reliance as protection. Being chased can feel like being monitored. Being fixed can feel like being judged. Being rescued can feel like being seen as incapable or incomplete. Even when these behaviors come from care, the avoidance system experiences them as threats. The more someone tries to pull them closer, the more distance they instinctively create to regain equilibrium. When the chasing stops, something unexpected happens. The nervous system has space to breathe. Without the constant signal that closeness is being demanded, the avoidant no longer needs to defend their independence. This absence of pressure creates a neutral zone where attachment can begin forming naturally. Instead of reacting, the avoidant can finally respond. Being fixed implies that something about them is wrong. Many avoidants carry a deep, unspoken belief that intimacy requires them to change who they are. When someone stops trying to analyze, correct, or heal them, that belief is challenged. They are allowed to exist without explanation. This is deeply regulating. Acceptance without intervention communicates safety more powerfully than reassurance ever could. Rescue dynamics are equally destabilizing. When someone tries to save an avoidant from their emotions, their past, or their coping strategies. It reinforces the idea that closeness comes with dependency. Avoidants often equate dependency with vulnerability, and vulnerability with loss of control. When rescue is removed, they are no longer positioned as fragile or broken. They are met as whole. This equality creates the conditions for genuine connection. The shift occurs when the avoidant realizes they are free to move toward connection rather than being pulled. Freedom of choice is essential. Attachment that forms under pressure feels dangerous. Attachment that forms under autonomy feels safe. When there is no chase, the avoidant can feel the absence and notice what it reveals. Often, it is in the quiet space left behind that attachment becomes conscious. Without someone constantly trying to keep the connection alive, the avoidant must confront their own emotional responses. They may notice a sense of loss, curiosity, or longing. These emotions surface not because they were forced, but because the defensive structure is no longer occupied with resistance. Distance, when not weaponized, becomes clarifying rather than soothing. This is why avoidants often begin attaching after someone steps back into self-respect, not as a tactic, but as a boundary. When a person no longer abandons themselves to maintain proximity, the dynamic equalizes. The avoidant is no longer the one with all the power. Instead, both individuals stand on their own ground. From this place, connection feels mutual rather than coerced. True attachment requires agency. Avoidants need to feel that closeness is something they choose, not something that happens to them. When chasing, fixing, and rescuing cease, agency is restored. The avoidant can approach at their own pace, guided by safety rather than fear. And when they do, the attachment that forms is not reactive or fragile. It is deliberate, grounded, and real. Emotional depth in avoidance activates only after they feel their boundaries are genuinely respected, not tolerated, negotiated, or strategically honored. For an avoidant, boundaries are not walls designed to keep love out. They are stabilizers that make connection possible. Without them, closeness feels chaotic and unsafe. Many avoidants learned early that their emotional or physical limits were ignored, overridden, or misunderstood, so their nervous system equates boundary violations with emotional danger. Until boundaries feel safe, depth cannot emerge. Respecting boundaries means more than giving space when asked. It means not resenting that space, not using it as evidence of disinterest, and not subtly punishing the avoidant for needing it. Avoidants are acutely sensitive to emotional undercurrents. Even when words say, "I understand," the body language, tone, and emotional reactions often communicate the opposite. When boundaries are followed by disappointment, withdrawal, or tension, the avoidance system registers that closeness comes at a cost. Depth shuts down in response. When boundaries are truly respected, something new becomes possible. The avoidant begins to feel that they do not have to choose between connection and self-preservation. Their system relaxes because it is no longer preparing to defend its limits. This relaxation is essential. Emotional depth does not emerge from vigilance. It emerges from regulation. When the body feels safe, the emotional world can expand. Many people mistakenly believe that emotional depth grows through pushing past boundaries. For avoidance, the opposite is true. Pushing past boundaries reinforces the belief that intimacy is invasive. Respecting boundaries, on the other hand, creates a container in which vulnerability can arise naturally. The avoidant learns through experience that their no is honored and their yes is not exploited. Over time, this builds trust not just in the other person, but in the relationship itself. Boundaries also allow the avoidant to approach closeness incrementally. When they know they can pull back without consequence, they are more willing to step forward. This push-pull rhythm is often misunderstood as ambivalence, but it is actually a form of self-regulation. Each approach tests whether safety remains intact. When it does, emotional depth quietly increases. Respecting boundaries communicates a powerful message. You are not being consumed. This message is deeply soothing to someone whose early experiences taught them that closeness leads to overwhelm or loss of self. When that fear is no longer activated, curiosity and emotional openness begin to surface. The avoidant may start sharing thoughts, memories, or feelings that were previously kept private. This sharing is not dramatic. It is careful, measured, and deeply meaningful. Another critical aspect of boundary respect is emotional pacing. Avoidants need time to process emotions internally before expressing them. When someone allows this pacing without rushing for clarity or reassurance, it honors the avoidant's internal rhythm. This respect reduces the pressure to perform emotionally and increases the likelihood of authentic expression. Depth that emerges under pressure is often shallow or defensive. Depth that emerges under respect is real. Over time, the avoidant's internal narrative begins to change. Instead of associating intimacy with boundary loss, they begin to associate it with stability. They learn that they can be close without being overwhelmed, seen without being invaded, and loved without being controlled. This shift is profound. It does not happen through conversation or explanation, but through consistent, respectful behavior. Emotional depth, once activated, often surprises even the avoidant themselves. They may not recognize how deeply they are attached until they notice a new desire to stay, to invest, or to be emotionally present. This depth was always possible, but it required one essential condition: the freedom to exist within their boundaries. When that freedom is protected, emotional depth is no longer a risk. It becomes a refuge. Vulnerability in avoidance does not emerge because they are persuaded, reassured, or logically convinced that it is safe. It emerges when they sense unconditional acceptance, acceptance that is not dependent on performance, availability, or emotional output. For an avoidant, conditional love is deeply familiar. Many learned early that affection was tied to behavior, usefulness, emotional compliance, or self-suppression. As a result, they adapted by minimizing needs and keeping their inner world private. Vulnerability, to them, feels like exposure to judgment or rejection unless proven otherwise. Unconditional acceptance communicates something radically different. You do not have to earn closeness. This message reaches the nervous system before it reaches the mind. Avoidants are highly attuned to subtle emotional cues. They sense when love is offered freely versus when it comes with expectations attached. When acceptance feels conditional, vulnerability shuts down. The avoidant becomes strategic, distant, or emotionally muted. When acceptance feels unconditional, defenses soften, not because they are dropped intentionally, but because they are no longer needed. Conditional love often sounds supportive on the surface, but carries hidden requirements. Statements like, "I'm here for you, but I need more from you," or "I understand your space, but it hurts me," can unintentionally reinforce the belief that closeness creates obligation. Even silent expectations can be felt. The avoidance system registers that vulnerability will cost them something. In contrast, unconditional acceptance removes the transactional nature of connection. It allows vulnerability to arise without fear of debt. For an avoidant, being accepted as they are, without urgency to change, open up, or be more emotionally expressive, is profoundly regulating. It challenges the internal belief that their authentic self is too much, not enough, or somehow wrong. When they realize they are not being evaluated, measured, or managed, curiosity replaces caution. They begin to explore emotional expression not to meet someone else's needs, but because it feels internally safe to do so. This is where vulnerability begins, not in confession, but in subtle exposure. A personal opinion shared, a memory mentioned, a moment of emotional honesty offered without explanation. These are not small steps for an avoidant. They are significant risks. When these moments are met with calm presence rather than heightened reaction, the safety loop strengthens. The avoidant learns that vulnerability does not lead to loss of control or emotional overwhelm. Unconditional acceptance also means allowing inconsistency without punishment. Avoidants often fear that vulnerability will trap them in expectations they cannot sustain. When they are accepted, even when they pull back, change pace, or need solitude, the fear loosens. They no longer have to choose between honesty and autonomy. This is crucial. Vulnerability cannot coexist with the fear of being trapped. Another important aspect is the absence of emotional bargaining. Avoidants sense when vulnerability is being encouraged for the sake of closeness rather than connection. When someone can remain emotionally grounded, regardless of how much or how little is shared, it signals safety. The avoidant does not feel responsible for maintaining emotional equilibrium. This freedom allows vulnerability to arise organically. Over time, unconditional acceptance rewires the avoidant's internal model of relationships. They begin to associate closeness with steadiness rather than scrutiny. Vulnerability becomes less about exposure and more about authenticity. They may still move slowly. They may still guard certain parts of themselves, but the direction shifts. Instead of protecting against intimacy, they begin to lean toward it. This process is often invisible from the outside. Avoidants rarely announce that they feel safe, but internally, something fundamental changes. The inner dialogue moves from, "I have to protect myself," to, "I can be myself here." And that shift, quiet, gradual, deeply embodied, is where true vulnerability is born. The turning point for avoidance happens internally, often long before they ever express it outwardly, because their emotional world is processed privately, not relationally. Avoidants are not disconnected from their feelings. They are deeply internal with them. What appears as indifference or distance on the outside is often a complex inner dialogue, unfolding beneath the surface. They feel first, analyze second, and reveal last, if at all. This is why the moment of deep attachment is rarely visible when it actually occurs. Internally, the avoidant begins to notice subtle shifts. The thought of someone lingers longer than expected. Emotional neutrality gives way to quiet concern or curiosity. They may replay conversations, notice absences, or feel a sense of comfort tied to someone's presence. These experiences do not immediately translate into action because the avoidance system is still assessing risk. Attachment is not avoided because it is unwanted, but because it feels dangerous until proven safe. This internal turning point often arrives when the avoidant realizes that connection has become regulating rather than destabilizing. Without consciously deciding, they start to feel calmer after interactions instead of drained. They may notice that the urge to withdraw is less reactive and more optional. These changes are subtle but significant. The nervous system is recalibrating, even if behavior has not caught up yet. Because avoidance values self-sufficiency, they are slow to externalize emotional dependence. Admitting attachment feels like relinquishing control, so they test it internally first. They ask themselves unspoken questions. Do I feel pressured? Do I feel trapped? Do I feel safe being myself? When the answers increasingly lean towards safety, attachment deepens quietly. This internal attachment often grows in contradiction to their outward behavior. They may still maintain distance, appear inconsistent, or prioritize independence. This mismatch can be confusing to others. This shift creates internal tension, not outward clarity. Importantly, avoidants do not always act on this attachment immediately. They may need time to reconcile it with their identity. Attachment challenges long-held beliefs about safety, control, and self-reliance. Integrating it requires patience. When rushed, the avoidant may retreat again, not because the attachment disappeared, but because it has not yet been fully processed. The internal turning point is where attachment becomes real, even if unseen. It is the moment when emotional investment is no longer hypothetical. The avoidant begins to care in ways that are not strategic or defensive. This caring exists quietly, often protected, waiting for confirmation that it can be expressed without cost. Understanding this internal process reframes avoidant behavior. Silence does not mean absence of feeling. Distance does not mean lack of attachment. Often, the deepest shifts happen where no one is watching. And when an avoidant finally does express attachment, It is not sudden. It is simply the outward reflection of a bond that has already been growing, patiently and privately, within. Thank you for staying, for listening with an open heart, and for allowing these words to meet you where you are. If something here resonated, trust that it did so for a reason. Growth always begins with awareness, and awareness is the first act of courage. You did not arrive here by accident. As we part, carry this with you. You do not need to chase love, explain your worth, or abandon yourself to be chosen. What is meant to stay will meet you in safety, not anxiety. Let patience guide you, let wisdom ground you, and let self-respect lead the way. Goodbye for now. May clarity replace confusion, peace replace longing, and may the love you seek first find you within.